All right. You guys ready for this? Let's go ahead and open our Bibles to Job chapter 39. Job chapter 39. Now, as you're opening your Bibles, we'll talk about 38 for just a quick second. God now appears on the scene. This large thunderstorm has been approaching from a distance, and they keep making reference to it. Now it's finally here. Everybody has scattered. It's lightning, it's thunder. There's this tempest that's just brewing around Job at this time. And in the beginning of chapter 38, it tells us that God addresses Job out of the whirlwind. Another way of saying that is out of the tempest. Now, the amazing thing is that when God comes on the scene, he's coming on as Yahweh, not as Elohim. He's coming in as the covenant God, that personal relationship God, not the monarch, I am king. And God would have every right to. In fact, most monarchs, if you were to put this at a human level, if somebody within their realm is bad-mouthing them, they don't come in as a friend, as it were. They come in as the king. They come in as the monarch, and it's my law, it stands, and whether you like it or not, that's what it's going to be. Oftentimes, they would be punished on the spot to include death. That's what this difference is when we see Yahweh coming with capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D. It's God coming in to Job and say, okay, Job, you give dark counsel. It's wrong. I'm going to educate you, not punish you. I'm coming in lovingly, not coming in a sense of punitive. That's the huge difference. When you see Elohim in your scriptures, it's God being king and coming with his regalness and the weight of the law. When you see God coming in as Yahweh, he's coming in as a friend, he's coming in as a teacher, he's coming in as the one who made the promise of the Redeemer. Then in 38, God starts addressing Job. He basically asks a question. He says, who is this who darkens counsel by words without knowledge? The question's a telling one. God's not happy with what Job has said. It says that Job, when he has been speaking, it's been being done so in a way that God disapproves of. Basically what it says to us, what it said to Job, Job, you're being a bad witness. Job's salvation isn't in doubt here. His relationship with God isn't in doubt here. But how he represents God is the part that God has to come in and fix. He then tells Job that he needs to gird his loins like a man. Or like we talked about last week, it's the Marine Corps version of suck it up, stand up, and be ready to be addressed. It's kind of like you need to come in here and stand at attention. Then God asks Job, after that statement, a number of questions. Now, granted, they're rhetorical questions, but God's trying to get his point across. He asks Job, were you here to give me advice when I made the heavens and the earth? Were you here to show me how to do my job? Were you here for me to consult with before creation even came into being? So as we get into chapter 39, we're going to see that God continues this series of rhetorical questions that he's asking Job. Now, most of the last chapter actually focused upon the heavens and creation. But now, well, in Psalm 19, verse 1, it says, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows his handiwork. It's a reminder to God, or a reminder to Job from God that, hey, all you have to do is look at the cosmos, look at creation. You will see me in that. And then, as we continue on into chapter 38, we start, basically the last part of 38, we see God referencing his animal creations. Chapter 39 is going to start with that same focus. In verse 1 it says, do you know the time when the wild mountain goat bear young, or can you mark when the deer gives birth? Now, Job is very familiar with the life cycle of domestic sheep and goats, but God is asking a different question. It's the idea of who is the shepherd of those animals, sheep and goats that are in the wild. He's pointing to the natural wonders that we see each and every day in the animal kingdom, and he's asking for Job basically an explanation. Do you take care of them? Are you the one that guides them? Are you the one that gets them to do the things that they do? Now, in the wild, shepherds do go out with their flocks. In the wild, they're there to keep away, not in the wild, but domestically, shepherds go out to the flocks. Domestically, they're there to protect the flocks because they really have you ever seen a sheep? What defense does it have against a wolf? Only the shepherd, right? Because that soft, fuzzy outer covering doesn't do it any good. You know, I still remember years ago that a biology professor once said that sheep and rabbits are the two ultimate in prey food because they have no natural defenses whatsoever. That God created them to be food. Yet, if you consider that, and you consider what happens in the wilderness, you'd be amazed that they're actually wild goats. You'd be amazed that they're wild sheep. Why aren't they all dead? Why haven't they all been hunted down? Who's the shepherd that takes care of them to keep them from harm's way, but also to keep them when the time is right for birthing? God's saying that that's me. I'm the one that is their help. I am the one that is their overseer. In verse 2, he says, can you number the months that they fulfill, or do you know the time when they bear young? Again, it's the idea between wild and domestic. Job can't understand. He can't see when the pregnancies start within the animals. So how can he possibly tell when the wild animals will give birth? Not only that, there's a difference too in the fact that within domestic animals, we have a tendency to bring them together and get them to mate when we want them to. So that the shepherd only has to set aside, say, 3 weeks in the spring in order to get all the lambs born. In the wild, it doesn't work that way. In the wild, there's a much broader time period. Again, though, who's taking care of all of that? In verse 3, he says, they bow down, they bring forth their young, they deliver their offspring. There's no help from the shepherd, and yet the animals do just fine. Verse 4, their young ones are healthy. They grow strong with grain. They depart and do not return to them. It's the idea that as we continue the lifestyle or life cycle of these animals, that time period when a ewe is most vulnerable is at the time that they give birth. And considering the fact that when this was written, there were still lions, there were still bears in the Middle East, wolves, wild dogs, all of that was still in place. God's pointing out, I am the one that is their shepherd. I am the one who guards over them when they give birth. Just because you're not there, Job, doesn't mean that the animals are in dire straits and in poor chronic health. In fact, it's the opposite. In fact, verse 4 in the Hebrew literally says their young ones are fat. It's the idea that these kids literally are young and healthy and robust. Now, verse 4, finishing verse 4, it says that they grow strong with grain. It's actually the idea, it's more of a Chaldean word than it is a Hebrew word, and it's the idea that they actually grow up in the open and wild places. That when you look at the place where these animals grow up, you would wonder, what do they eat? And yet God takes care of them. He keeps charge over them. Jesus says the same thing in Matthew chapter 10, verses 29 through 31. He says, are not 2 sparrows sold for a copper coin? And not one of them falls to the ground apart from your Father's will. But the very hairs of your head are all numbered. Do not fear, therefore, you are of more value than many sparrows. Jesus, when talking, says to the people that are around him, hey, God knows all. It's all of God's creation. When a sparrow falls from the sky, it happens by his will. He knows about it. You being much more valuable than the sparrows, don't you think that God is going to engage in your life even more? That's the idea behind it. When Jesus talks about it, he's talking about, in a sense, the same thing that Job's talking about. God's talking to Job. God's telling Job, I'm the one that takes care of the animals. And then Jesus comes in and says, and the animals mean about this much, and you mean so much more. So why do you think that I wouldn't engage you? Why do you think I am punishing you? Why do you think, fill in the blanks of, I'm having a really rough time, that God's abandoned you? He hasn't. He thinks much more of you than he does the rest of the animal kingdom. In verse 5, he says, who set the wild donkey free, who loosed the bonds of the onager. Now, there's a bit of a difference today. The wild donkeys of Job's day, they roamed the countryside very much like bison roamed the plains of the United States. There were a lot of them. They'd be in large numbers, and they would gather together and make their journeys in the fall and the spring, and thousand plus herds would move, and they would head into Persia, or they would head towards greener pastures as the time was taking. But they didn't have a human shepherd to lead them to these green water and this fresh water and green pastures. Hopefully it's not green water, but I have seen them drink it before. They have the Lord being the one that does it. Now, an onager, as you can see up there, is just a wild donkey that inhabits this area of northern Iran. If you look, that's a modern donkey. That's on the Palm Sunday Road. But you can see kind of the resemblance to one another. Now, the thing is that all the donkeys that you see in the Middle East and in Asia, they started, and also big part of Europe, they come from this animal here. But the idea behind the onager is that it was very wild. That it's not something that was easily tamed. It took a lot of work. In verse 6, he talks about the onager. And he says, whose home I have made in the wilderness, and barren land is his dwelling. Folks, the onager was a very difficult animal to domesticate. You cannot just go out and catch one thinking that you're going to turn it into your beast of burden. As a matter of fact, they've been doing studies to go from wolf. Well, if you take a wolf, you can never get the wolf all the way out of it. You have to actually breed in other species. To even come close, it takes 7 generations. The same thing goes with coyotes. If it's a fully wild coyote, you've got to go 7 generations to get one that's fully domesticated. It's not just on those that are the prey type. It also happens with beasts of burden as well. That cattle, to go from wild to domesticated, 7 generations. Burros, 7 generations. You can't, this is a long-term thing. This isn't just a short-term thing. And so I almost imagine God's pulling up something from Job's youth and going, okay, remember that time that you went out there and you roped that donkey? And you really thought that you were going to turn it into something more than what it is? How did that teach you? I mean, because we've all done stupid stuff like that in our youth. And God's talking about that it's up to him. He's the one that made the decision that this donkey's home would be in the desert. He's the one that set this animal up to prosper in a place that was normally desolate and where humans have a difficult time finding food. In verse 6, the word for barren land is actually salty places. It's the idea that they go out into the place where you won't survive. And then in verse 7, he says, he scorns the tumult of the city, meaning the donkey. He does not heed the shouts of the driver. The range of the mountains is his pasture, and he searches after every green thing. Now, those of you who have been to my house have seen that we have horses. Have you ever seen anything green in the back pasture? That's because the moment that it shows up, they eat it. They live for eating anything that is green. The same things with these donkeys. The only thing that they have on their mind is food. And because of that, they do not respect man and his ways. They don't give heed to a jockey or a teamster. They're not subject to restraint. In this particular case that God's speaking to Job, it's the onager being the definition of what it means to be wild, what it means to inhabit a place where we can't live. In verse 9 it says, will the wild ox be willing to serve you? Will he bed by your manger? So, God has now talked to Job about using a raven in the previous chapter, mountain goats, the wild donkey. And now he turns to the wild ox. Now, how many of your translations say unicorn? None of your translations say unicorn? Because the word used is actually means unicorn, but this is the unicorn they're talking about. It's a rhinoceros, folks. It's not a wild ox in the sense that we think of a wild ox. It's a rhinoceros. These are huge animals. And if you ever seen them, you know that they have a pretty nasty disposition. So once again, this is a rhetorical question for Job. Now that you understand this, read it this way. Will the rhinoceros be willing to serve you? Will the rhinoceros bed by your manger? Of course not. Not only that, but you wouldn't want him there, because if he was in your pen, it would be destroyed in short order. In verse 10, can you bind the wild ox or the rhinoceros in the furrow with ropes? Or will he plow the valleys behind you? Can you imagine somebody hooking up a yoke to one of these things and getting them to pull a plow through the soil in order that there would be food? I mean, water buffalo are hard enough to tame. In fact, every year you hear stories out of Southeast Asia where people are killed time and time again just by dealing with the water buffalo that are supposed to be trained in order to pull the plow for the rice fields. Now imagine trying to do it with a rhinoceros. It's the idea of, can you get the rhinoceros to submit to your will? In verse 11 it says, will you trust him because his strength is great? Or will you leave your labor to him? It's a contrast. Will you give the same amount of trust that you would give your normal oxen or your normal team? Would you give a rhinoceros the same amount of trust when it comes to plowing the ground or to working the soil in any way, shape, or form? Verse 12, will you trust him to bring home your grain and gather it to your threshing floor? Wow. Rhinoceros isn't going to care. Go ahead, rope one. Try to throw your sheaves of wheat on the back of it and see if it'll take it over to the winnowing field. Or, if he's going to go to the threshing floor, you better have some very high walls. Because you need to jump out, and you need to be able to jump out really quick. The thing is that the outcome, no matter what, is going to be a very bad one. But who takes care of the rhinoceros? Who could yoke it? The Lord, of course. He can. He can do these things. That's that contrast that's being brought in right now. Is Job, can you do this with the rhinoceros? Knowing that the answer for God is, I can do it. Remember, he's been saying that God is wrong. He's been saying that God has made a mistake, and he has been saying that if I get my chance to stand before God, then I'm going to have my say. These questions are coming at Job as that contrast, going, you really want to have this conversation? Do you really think I don't know what I'm doing? Because I do. In verse 13, he continues on. He says, the wings of the ostrich wave proudly. But are her wings and pinions like that, like the kindly storks? Now, the previous couple of verses talked about animals literally of the desert. Now we're going to talk about birds of the desert. And it's interesting to note, you've seen ostriches. Have you ever been to the ostrich farm that's over by Picacho Peak in Arizona? They have thousands of them over there. If you go in there, you'll find the eggs are about yay big. Sometimes, and you can get hollowed out ones, but you can also get ones that have been refrigerated. Because ostrich don't care. They lay somewhere to the tune of, like, when it's time for them to lay eggs, they lay to the tune of 55 to like 128 of them. And you know what they do with them? They drop them in the sand and leave them there. That's it. Now consider that with the stork. The stork is the idea of fertility because in our culture it brings the babies, right? It's because they make these giant nests and that they take care of the young and they do a good job with it. And yet when you look at the ostrich, you're like, that's a bird? It acts nothing like a bird. But what God is trying to do is that by themselves, without any human intervention, these animals not only survive, but they thrive. They have their own ways of doing things that God has taught them. It makes absolutely no sense to us. And it's the idea that when you sit back and consider God's creation just as animal kingdom, that in the way that they do things, you would think, well, that's a bad mom, or that's not how I would do it. And yet, if we stop to consider it, for that animal, it's that best way because God has said so. It's His wisdom that is working within them. In verse 14 it says, for she leaves her eggs on the ground and warms them in the dust. Going back, that's what she does. She deposits her eggs in the sand and that's it. She doesn't care. She doesn't guard them. They become food for others. In verse 15, she forgets that a foot may crush them or that a wild beast may break them. She treats her young harshly as though they were not hers. Her labor is in vain without concern. And it's true. They have to separate the young ostriches from the older ostriches because they'll kill them. And you think you had a tough childhood. All right? Imagine growing up where your mom doesn't care about you. Not only that, but every time you show up, she wants to kill you. Yes, Annie?
Ostriches and rhinoceroses in Israel at that time.
More than likely, they had them in the area, yes. You have to understand that a lot of this stuff was coming up from Africa. But the other portion of it is, remember that we're about 212 years from the Tower of Babel. And the Tower of Babel is just shortly after Noah. And so if we look at the ark landing on the mountains of Aratu, not Ararat, but Aratu, which is a bit north. It's basically northern Iran. And then you have all of the animals coming from the ark, heading into their directions and going those different ways. So they would be familiar with them. In verse 17 it says, because God deprived her of wisdom and did not endow her with understanding. God's not given her the same wisdom that He gave other birds, yet God still does take care of them. But even so, you would be amazed that ostriches could even survive given that type of care that their young receive. And ostriches may appear weak, timid, and unwise. I'm not so sure about the weak. But she still has her qualities that set her apart from the other animals. Verse 18 brings us to that point. It says, when she lifts herself on high, she scorns the horse and its rider. When you look at how powerful and how fast an ostrich is, this big, ugly, dumb bird that doesn't take care of its young, in fact, has to be separated from them when we get into farms, will turn into a majestic beast when somebody charges it on a horseback. And it will outrun the horse. It'll outrun the fastest of horses. God's ways are not our ways. God's wisdom is not our wisdom. What it says is that she can outrun the hunter. In verse 19 it says, have you given the horse strength? Have you clothed his neck with thunder? Can you frighten him like a locust? His majestic snorting strikes terror. We're not talking about any old horse. We're talking about a war horse here. Now again, we're only a few hundred years from the ark. The idea of horses already being on the scene, and now that they have them as war horses, that they've been turned into something else. I mean, having horses myself, right? I still remember when Aramis was probably about 6 months old. And we had Bobby the mare, and we had another horse there that didn't belong to us that somebody, a young lady had, and she was keeping there. And I was standing in the corral one day, and I was back by the house, when all of a sudden, all three of them come charging at me. And when you see 1,000-pound, 2,000-pound animals and about 600-pound animal coming at you, you get a little nervous, right? And I still remember, I'm just standing there because if I move, I'm going to get into one of their paths, and I am going to get thumped. All of a sudden, Bobby whips around my back shoulder, and she puts her head over my right shoulder, and then she just blows really hard at whatever she's looking. It was, save me! What had startled her was a cat, a little cat, that was probably about 400 or 500 feet from where they were. So to consider that the horse is the perfect prey animal, then consider the war horse and what it was turned into. It's amazing. Now horses, cavalry horses, were feared. It was the worst type of, or the most feared type of warfare up until the 20th century when we moved to tanks. And they still call tanks cavalry. And yet, when you look at them as they're coming forward in battle, just like locusts, they come in wave after wave after wave. The first set of horses charges forward and stops. The second group behind them goes through between each of the other horses that's in front, and they move just like a locust move. When you see them, how they come forward, they'll hop, and then they stop, and then another wave comes over the top of them. But the thing is that the snorting of a war horse coming at you like locusts, it scares you. Again, you've got, at this time, I would imagine the horses are probably about 1,200 pounds. Now, they didn't have the chainmail and everything that we see happening in the Middle Ages, but still, when a horse is coming at you, it does get you to quake in your shorts. In verse 15, she forgets that a foot may crush them, or that a wild beast may... Oh, I'm sorry. We got to go back. Where are we? Verse 21. Nope. Yeah, verse 21. He paws in the valley and rejoices in his strength. He gallops into the clash of arms. One of the things that war horses are known about is that in their training, they get excited. That they know that war is afoot. And what they do is that as they're waiting in ranks to go charge into the enemy, the horses will begin pawing the ground. They're anxious. They want to get going. They know that they have a job to do. And then once he is released, he gallops. He doesn't turn and go the other way. The war horse drives forward into the clash of arms, gets in the midst of the fray. And then in verse 22, this animal that normally runs away, it says, he mocks at fear and is not frightened, nor does he turn back from the sword. In the midst of the battle, this horse has been trained to be something that he's not normally, not in the wild. I don't know if you've ever read the stories about medieval battles, but what horses would do, what they would teach horses to do in those battles. Not only did you just have the rider who had a sword in his hand or a bow or a pike, but the horses would come in and they would rear up. And the idea of rearing is not to be scared. The idea was to kick those feet forward and hit the enemy with the feet. And then once they're down, they land on top of them and they trample the enemy underground. Or underground, not in, what did I say? Underfoot. It's not a pretty sight. In verse 23, it talks about how the horse is arrayed. That the quiver rattles against him, the glittering spear and the javelin. So not only does he just have a rider and maybe a small rudimentary saddle, but also attached to this horse is going to be a quiver full of arrows, also a javelin or something there. It's the idea that he's coming in for war. In verse 24, he devours the distance with fierceness and rage, nor does he come to a halt, because the trumpet has sounded. So, when the trumpet sounds in battle, the first trumpet blast generally means charge. The second trumpet blast, when you're in the midst of battle, means to retreat or to reposition. The horse, though, devours the distance with fierceness and rage. It's eager to get into the battle. And it says, nor does he come to a halt because the trumpet has sounded. It means that he has this willingness, his desire to get into the fight. And then verse 25, at the blast of the trumpet, he says, okay, this is the first one. The smell of battle from afar, the thunder of captains in shouting. And when you're atop a horse and it gets excited, it starts moving its legs and it gets lathered up and you have a hard time controlling it. And what they're talking about here is exactly that. That relationship that a horse has with its rider that is just really wanting to get into the midst of this fight. And the rider is having to do everything he can to hold it from doing those things because that horse wants to get in there. Now, why is this brought up by Job? Why does God bring this up when he's talking about Job? Because it's not man's wisdom that created the war horse or gave it the ability to do these things. It was God that gave it the ability to do these things. God's the one that gave it the desire, as it were, to be able to be trained. And then think about what a majestic animal the horse is, arrayed in its finery, ready for Calvary. If you look today, you guys know about dressage and all of the really fine movements that you see horses do? That came out of the Middle Ages when these war horses would go up against each other. They started finding that it cost too much money to fix the horses, or they'd have to put down a horse and get another horse. So instead of doing that, they started developing all of these different movements that were applicable to warfare, and that's how you get dressage today. That's how you get the English riding that it is today. It came out of warfare. And look at how elegant and just majestic those horses are when they do that. But is that something that man has done? No. God's the one that gave them the abilities to do those things. In verse 26, God then asks Job the question. He says, does the hawk fly by your wisdom and spread its wings towards the south? Now consider the majesty of the hawk. Now the hawk being talked about here, it deals with the speed of the animal. The difference between hawks and eagles tends to be, when it's talked about biblically, is both size, but also how quickly they move. And you stand at awe. Think about back to the time of Job. The fastest thing that they had that they could see was the burro. The horse wasn't there yet. It was the donkey moving, maybe the ostrich. Okay? Now, imagine the hawk coming in. it's way up there, it puts its wings back and just starts diving. 60 plus miles an hour. Is that something that man did, or was that something God did? And then verse 27, does the eagle mount up at your command? Does it make its nest on high? These magnificent birds of prey, they've always been held in esteem. In fact, most cultures have turned them into gods, in a sense. And that they would start to pray to them because they see what great hunters they are. And they want some of that. That's why they would go kill them or take their feathers and adorn themselves with in order to get some of that mojo, as it were, from those animals. But they've always been held in high esteem. Now, God's asking, do you make the hawk fly, and do you get the eagle to rise in the air upon your command? And then also, let's look at the place where eagles and hawks perch. Is it generally down here on the ground where we can get to them? No. They tend to find the highest spots available. In verse 28, it says, on the rock it dwells and resides, on the crag of the rock and the stronghold. Good luck trying to get to the point where you can go and actually capture one. They live in some of the worst territory for mankind, and yet they prosper in these areas because the things that would go after them can't make it there either. Think about volcanic rock that's just basalt rocks just sticking up, and then you have this huge nest that's up in there. The chicks are inside of that nest, and it's just desolate all around. Yet the animals thrive. And from that nest, from that location, in verse 29, it says, from there it spies out the prey. Its eyes observe from afar. They say that they can see about 3 to 10 times better than we can at a distance, meaning that they can pick out movement of a mouse at about 1.5 miles away. Can you do that? No, not even close, right? It's amazing as I drive across Camp Pendleton, and you'll see the eagles or the hawks, and they'll be just on top of a pole, all right? In some cases, they'll be flying. And then all of a sudden, they tuck their wings, and they end up in the bushes, and they come out with either a rabbit or a mouse, a snake, something, right? And I'm like 20 feet away from it. I never saw it. I could be walking, and I've had that happen before. I hadn't a clue that thing was coming in until it scared the daylights out of me. In verse 30, it tells us, though, of these birds of prey, it says, its young ones suck up blood, and where the slain are, there it is. Now we're getting back to the idea of the war horse in the battlefield. Now the chicks of eagles and hawks, when they are very young, they're not able to eat a lot of flesh. So what happens is that mama bird, daddy bird, they go and they drink up the blood, and then they bring it back and it's coagulated, and that's what the animals eat. That's what they thrive on. As they get older, they'll start eating more and more flesh, and it's been given to them. But the principal source of food, of nourishment for birds of prey when they're young is actually the blood and not the flesh. So think about going back to where that war horse just was. These birds, they go out to these places of battle. They follow them around. It's not just eagles, it's not just hawks that's being talked about. When you see the word vulture in the Bible, speaking of the Middle East, it's really not vultures. They didn't have them in that area at the time. What they're talking about are eagles. And they go into those battlefields and they take advantage of the dead that are on the battlefield. It's not a pretty sight. But it's still, in fact, in a lot of cases, it's a gruesome sight to behold. But do you guys remember that basically in, what was it, in the book of Revelation, and I think it's also in Ezekiel, it talks about that God, when the armies get crushed, he calls the birds of the air and the beasts of the fields to come and feast. Because that's the reality of it. When there's nobody there to pick up remains. As that cycle of life now just continues. The thing is that God's trying to get, as he's talking to Job, is that your wisdom doesn't make any sense if you consider it against my wisdom. Can you do these things? Can you turn the rhinoceros into something that is going to plow the field? No, you can't. Can you understand the way of a war horse? No, you can't. Can you see how I provide for the hawks and the eagles? But it may not be your way. See, what God's trying to show Job in all of this, and it's kind of a weird way of doing it as you read through it, but it's really the fact that God's wisdom is beyond our wisdom. That we just can't understand it. So God starts off in chapter 38 basically asking rhetorical questions. Can you? Do you know how? What's the only thing that Job can answer to any of them? No, I haven't a clue, right? To man, each of the animals that listed here are what we might consider strong, noble, or smart animals. Some of them are to be feared naturally. Others are to be feared because of what we've done to them in the case of a war horse, yet at the same time, God had to allow it to happen. But altogether, it was God who provides and takes care of them. And he does it in ways that we wouldn't do. Have you ever prayed to God saying, God, I need this to happen. Can you please help me in this area? And then you give him the laundry list of going from A to B to C to D to, and just keep going down. This is how it should unfold, God. And then in the midst of all of it, you get exactly what you asked for, but you realize that God missed B, C, D, E, F, G. He went basically from A to Z and accomplished it in a way that you never would have dreamed of. Because God can do those things. Us? We want it planned out. We want to give God conditions. God's like, nah, my wisdom is beyond your wisdom. My ways are not your ways. My thoughts are above your thoughts. This is what he's trying to get to Job. He's trying to say, Job, you are not God. You need to understand a few things. But the one thing that Job needs to see in all of this is that although we've talked about all of these different animals and the way that God takes care of them, is that Job's so much more important than they are to God. God doesn't abandon these animals. Even though the burro grows up in a desolate place, in a place where humans can't survive, where the eagle sits up on these rocks that there's no way we can get up to, nor would we be able to survive were we up there living in those places. The idea that God's trying to get to Job is you're more important than all of these. So you're speaking out of turn, but I want to remind you that I love you and that I'm caring for you. That although you may see the glass is half empty, although you may see that you may think everything's going wrong. And for Job, I imagine that's where he's at. God's going, if I consider these things, how much more am I going to consider you? It's the same thing that Jesus said. Sparrows don't fall from the sky without God knowing. Yet how much more important are you than the sparrows? When you're considering that God has abandoned you, or you're in that position that Job's in going, you're asking the question, why God? Understand that God's never pulled his eyes off of you. understand that he loves you infinitely. Job's crying out because he hurts. God's coming in to say, Job, I understand your hurt. In fact, in about another 1,400, 1,500 years, I'm going to go and put myself on the cross for that. I'm going to make a way. But what you don't understand right now is that I have my wisdom and I have my ways. And Job, I need you to trust that you're going to hold on to that. That if I'm going to take care of these animals, how much more am I going to take care of you? If you rely on your wisdom, it's all going to go awry. But if you just trust me enough to stick with my wisdom. And isn't that the one thing that happens in our walks? I'd like to think that as I mature in the Lord, that my time from going, why God, to, okay, I'll trust in you, gets shorter. But I'm not so sure it's always the case. Because God oftentimes gets our attention. We get to that point and we go, why God? And then we hold on to that balloon. Rather than letting it go so that he can have it. I'm giving this to you, God. You're going to take care of it. I'm going to have that peace that comes into my heart. We send the balloon up, but we hold on to the string. It's not trust but verify with God. It's just simply trust. God's out for your best well-being. He's out for your loved one's best well-being. And he sure must think highly of us because we do get beat up. But we need to trust that God has a plan and a purpose that goes beyond anything that we can understand. And know that God is about saving souls and saving lives. So what may be important, hugely important to us, may not be that important to God, not the same level as it is to us. And we need to remember that and just trust that the Lord is going to take care of some of this. You guys mind if I share something for a second? When I was 14 years old, my mother ended up taking out her knee on a stair and ended up having to go in and have surgery done because there was a bunch of torn cartilage that was being done in there. And during, I think it was the third surgery to repair her knee, they cut through the sympathetic nerve without cauterizing it. And it does something, it gave her what was called sympathetic reflex dystrophy of the knee. They've changed the name, but it's the same thing. Think of a high tension wire that gets cut and is constantly alive. Now, while that's alive, or I should say, the sympathetic nervous system controls your vasculature. So first off, it's always painful, but the second part is that I would watch literally my mom's leg go big and then turn completely gray because there was no blood getting to it, and then it would just inflate, and it would get to easily, her calf would easily get to the size of my thigh because it was just so filled with edema from the blood and all of the other stuff. And we went through this for 7 years. And my mother received a medical device which literally overnight fixed the problem. It was something that was put into her back, right along the spine, and it short-circuited that out. We know them today as neurostems. I still remember I was so excited because God answered all the prayers. Now, how old was I? I think I was 20 when this happened. That means that Monica was 18, Julie was 16, and Jeff was 14. It also means that when you consider that Jeff was maybe 7 when this happened, he never got to know the same mother that I got to know. I got to watch my mother go back to work. She was a nurse. She specialized in ICU, but because her knee and that leg had atrophied so much over the years, she was able to get her nursing license back. But then she went to what was called a step-down ICU nurse. I got to see my parents dance for the first time in 7 years. There was finally enough income coming in, because Dad was a police officer, that We weren't eating ramen half of the month. And the thing is that during that time, I was so happy. Then while I was in Korea, I get a phone call from my mother saying that she had fallen and it had hurt her back and that it had hurt this neurostem. And that she just had to wait another 30 days to get the new digital version versus the analog. It was a 510K, for those of you who know what I'm talking about. I still remember. I talked to her, and then 3 days later, Denise calls me up and says, Gary, I'm so sorry. I'm like, what happened? Mom's dead. I'm like, your mom? Because Esther's a lot older than my mother was. My mom was maybe 46, 47. And no, she wasn't even that old. She was maybe 45, 43. Anyways, I still remember being so mad at God. I was in that, how dare you? It's almost like somebody coming up and giving you the, well, here, this is what look, this is the dream thing that you dreamed of all this time. And then God goes, nope, sorry. I was so angry at God. I wanted nothing to do with the Lord. Yet he never gave up on me. He kept hitting me upside the head with 2x4s to get my attention. But it took me quite a while to realize the gift that he had given me. That while I was in the midst of the pain, I viewed it completely different. But once I was able to separate and understand that God only wants the best for us, I realized what a blessing it was. You see, during that 7 years, my mother almost died 3 separate times. Julie and Jeff, my youngest brother and sister, they would never have known Mom the way I know my mom if it wasn't for that 1.5 year, 2 year time period for which she was healthy. They have no memory of my parents dancing. So what I looked at as a how dare you, I look back on and go, wow, God, you were so gracious. You gave back to our family something that we had been missing for a long time. And you got to see, we got to see, and we got to embrace. And then, yes, my mother was taken. Granted, it was sudden. But only when you separate yourself out can you see that God had a different plan. And what he had for us was a blessing. Now, I'm not going to lie to you. It hurt like hell. But yet I can stand back now and see it for what it actually was. I can see that although it really was rough to live in that time period, the struggles, being the eldest son, being the one that had to take care of my brothers and sisters, turning into the soccer mom to take brothers and sisters to all other. As soon as I turned 16, it was, here are the keys, you take the kids. My brothers and sisters would probably sit there and go, yeah, but do you realize how many times we had to eat burnt hamburger helper? But what I'm sharing this with you for is because I have a unique perspective now, different from a lot of people. And that although we may be in the midst of a crisis, although we may find ourselves down in the doldrums because of the circumstances that surround us at this particular moment, God never stopped loving you. He never stops caring for you. Count each little blessing, because when you're able to eventually separate yourself from the feelings that you have right now, you're going to realize that God loved you, loved the person that was involved in your life at that particular moment. And you're just going to sit there in amazement and just thank him. But it is hard right now. It's hard to look at our loved ones, but know that God gives us a peace that passes all understanding. If you let go of the balloon, you say you're going to give it to him, don't hold on to the string. Give it to him. You think Jesus didn't suffer emotional hurt? There's no mention of Joseph as he got older. Let's assume that Joseph passed away sometime during the time he was growing up. During Jesus' time, a lot of people passed away around him. Jesus saw a lot of stuff that we don't see today in our sheltered society. But that didn't stop him from putting himself up on the cross for us so that we can have peace. Trust in that peace. Know that God's ways are not our ways. Know that his thoughts are so much above our thoughts, and that he loves you with a love you can't possibly imagine. Let's pray.